All right,
Hello.
well, all right. Welcome everyone back to Israel National Radio. I'm Ari Lewis. Thank you everyone for listening in. We're going to talk about a huge event which may or may not happen with a good friend of mine and a good person who is in the know to talk about this. The director and the author of Split Decision Story of Guillermo Rigondo. Welcome back to the program, Brin-Jonathan Butler. Brin, how you doing out there?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and we have a lot to talk about, I hope. It's very, very confusing what's going on. We were told a few weeks ago the deal was about to be signed. What is the latest between Floyd Mayweather and, of course, Manny Pacquiao?
Well, according to Bob Arum, there were 4 issues left to be resolved, and I think 2 days ago he mentioned in social media that 2 of them, without mentioning what they were or what remained, had been solved. So we're down to 2, and then I think within 2 hours, that whole account of Arum's was refuted by Mayweather's camp and Showtime and Steven Espinosa, the head of that network. So basically we have no idea where things are at, whether they're improving, whether they're devolving. It's incredibly confusing.
Do you have an idea of what the 2 things were that were decided on, the 2 that weren't?
I think the likely thing, as far as a stumbling block, would be who would rebroadcast the fight after it's first aired. And the precedent that was set for this kind of event was Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, who had the same opposing networks as Pacquiao and Mayweather. And what the deal was with that fight was that the winner of the fight and his representative network would air the rebroadcast, essentially own the broadcast for all future dates when it was shown. Looking back at the Lewis fight, it's now seen as an HBO fight, whereas it was co-broadcast. So I think that HBO is very resistant to agree to that, given that Mayweather, as of now, is a 3-1 favorite against Pacquiao.
Okay, so that's certainly something to hold up there. Now, I know when they did the broadcast with Lewis Tyson, they had a broadcast from HBO mix in with a broadcast from Showtime. You had Jim Lampley doing it with Bobby Ches. Would that type of thing happen if this fight does take place?
Yes, it would. And the other thing was that they had shared announcers, with Buffer announcing half of the introduction and Jimmy Lennon Jr. announcing the other half. So it's very bizarre, kind of surreal. But I mean, an event like this, we're looking at a pot between the 2 of them of around $200 million guaranteed, with possibly more if it sells in excess of 3 million pay-per-views. So everybody wants a piece of this, because, it's unlikely that we could see another one of this size for a generation.
Now, I'm glad you brought up the money, because I was speaking with a friend of mine on Friday, and I said if this thing goes down, it will be the biggest sporting event ever in terms of money, bigger than the Super Bowl. He had a hard time wrapping his mind around that. Tell us why this would be the biggest money event in sports history.
Well, I think the biggest indication of that, well, there's a few indications of that are interesting. One is that somebody could make theoretically $200 million, could be won and lost between the 2 of them in the matter of a couple of rounds. The hotel, the travel, the gambling. I mean, the gambling's the main thing. That's the interesting thing with boxing in terms of revenue is casinos pay enormous site fees to bring boxing to Las Vegas. Where if it's the UFC actually has to sort of pay to play to have the UFC major events held in Las Vegas, because UFC, their demographic doesn't gamble, whereas boxing certainly always has and does, and I think always will. So I think the gambling revenue is the biggest thing. I think a fight like this, I mean, even going back to the mid-'90s, Tyson fights were estimated to be $1 billion surplus to Las Vegas for each and every fight, and that's him fighting nobodies. So something like this that would garner global attention, which I don't even know if the Super Bowl really does. Obviously, domestically, it's the biggest thing going in the U.S. as far as ratings, but globally, I think it's dwarfed by the World Cup, whereas an event like this with, Pacquiao, who's obviously a major international star, probably a bigger international star than Mayweather is, yeah, there's just no end to just how much anticipation there is for this and the impact on the culture. It's bigger than sports, so that's rare.
I imagine, Pacquiao being from the Philippines, the entire country, would it literally take the day off? Would it shut down to watch this fight?
I think they take the day off if he was fighting you or me, which is, the basic thing. People I know who've covered Pacquiao, I've covered him loosely when he's come into Hollywood, but never in the Philippines. But all of his fights, apparently, there's a zero crime rate across the Philippines. He's more famous than the president. He, again, transcends sport, transcends even the culture. I think he's almost some sort of deified figure over there. And, it's rare to have a transcendent Asian star as well. So I think there's an extra special pride there. Something like Bruce Lee, where he's transcended and entered Western culture, and that's rare and special, and they're extraordinarily proud of him.
Again, this is Israel National Radio. You're listening to Ari Lewis speak with Brin-Jonathan Butler. We're talking about the big Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, which may or may not happen. Going a little bit more into the money, you're talking about a potential 3 million buys at about $60 a pop. Is that what the rate would be?
Way more than that.
Wow.
I think the over-under right now is 3.1 million pay-per-view buys. You can actually gamble on this if the fight happens. So 3.1 million buys, and the estimates for how much each pay-per-view cost will be is $100. So right there you've got, $310 million right off the bat. And then the gate fee, which is negligible in comparison with pay-per-view, but nonetheless it would almost certainly break every record that's ever been there with boxing. It'll be held at the MGM Grand if it happens. I'm sure that all of those kind of micro issues have been resolved. MGM Grand, the kind of gloves, who comes out first, whose name is on the billboard and that kind of thing. But another $30 million there for the site fee, rather the live gate, whatever the site fee is that the MGM Grand pays for it. And somebody like Mayweather, the way that his contract is set up, it's calibrated so that he gets a piece of hot dogs that are sold, T-shirts, any kind of memorabilia that's associated with this event, he has a piece of. It's an extraordinary contract that Al Heyman has been the architect of. So he could walk away conceivably with over $150 million for a night's work.
And before we go into their meeting, just one last aspect of the money. Advertising obviously is part of it. It's different because it's pay-per-view. There's not really commercials, but in the arena, there are advertisements there. How does that money work out? Is it the MGM pays for the fight and then they can sell whatever ads they want, or does Mayweather get a piece of that too, in addition to the hot dogs and everything else?
I am not certain about that. I would assume that he would get a piece of it, because obviously it's on his back that money's being made. But I would assume that would be paid for by the two networks that would be broadcasting the event. That's who would, that they would have to purchase those with advertising dollars with those guys, in order to have those networks broadcast their products. So. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That would be extraordinary money as well. You've historically seen Pacquiao's represented by Nike, and beer companies are obviously always associated with boxing, but maybe some bigger, more conservative corporations could move in order to see their product associated with the fight on this scale.
Yeah, one of the biggest images, if you think, let's say, Mike Tyson, Michael Spinks, he punches him in the stomach, falls down, is right in front of this Diet Pepsi thing that's on the mat, and it always sticks in your mind, and whoever bought that ad was a genius because it's been replayed over and over and over. And again, so everyone listening, if you don't understand why it is the biggest thing of all time if it happens money-wise, now you understand. Let's talk about the meeting. Very strange. Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao meet at a Miami Heat game. Who set that up? How did that happen?
Well, they're claiming that it just organically happened by coincidence. I don't believe it for a second.
Yeah.
Michael, no way. Come on.
The odds
Yeah, they claim that they were trying to come to New York and there was a massive winter storm and so they were stuck, and Pacquiao, a friend of, I believe, the owner of the Miami Heat or somebody way up there who himself is Filipino, so he just stopped by a Miami Heat game and mysteriously Mayweather just drops in to Miami. So who knows? But anyway, they did meet at center court. They exchanged words. There was a massive chant, as there's been at many of the LA Lakers games, or maybe it's the Clippers games, that Mayweather's been to, fight Pacquiao, fight Pacquiao, fight Pacquiao. But he's really being harassed about it, much in the way Leonard was to fight Hagler. And so apparently at Mayweather's initiative, they exchanged phone numbers and met afterwards in a hotel room to discuss the parameters of the fight. And just today, a video was released of Mayweather from that meeting, Pacquiao sitting on the couch next to him, and Mayweather's saying, we need to make this happen. We both had great careers, but we are missing this fight from our careers and our legacies, and both of our legacies absolutely need this. So that's unusual, because traditionally his stance has been, I don't need anything to solidify my position as the best ever. So it's either encouraging or it's incredibly cynical. I'm leaning towards incredibly cynical, because he invested $1 million in a new app, which is where he has been denouncing Bob Arum updates on social media, and presumably he has negotiated in his contract the announcement of the fight will be with this new app that he is using to provide updates. So it just gets more and more bizarre and annoying, frankly.
Now, another bizarre aspect was a few years ago there were anti-Filipino comments made by Mayweather, claims it was someone else that took his Twitter handle, whatever, but calling him, I think, a dog and saying a bunch of prejudice things. And he said other things against Pacquiao. When they met, it was hard to tell through some of the pictures. It looked fairly cordial. It kind of looked like Mayweather was being a little more aggressive. Pacquiao a bit kind of backing up. He's just shucks type of guy. What was your take of the meeting? Did it look cordial to you, or did it look like Mayweather was trying to be the boss and take charge of things?
No, I think it did look cordial. It looked like there was some mutual respect, and the exchange of phone numbers, the smiles they had, it looked comfortable, and they looked disarmed in each other's presence. Apparently it's the first time they've ever met, which is an interesting thing, given, how long they've been in the sport. But yeah, I wonder, Mayweather has just been so shrewd at manipulating the public, and I think increasingly as they get annoyed and there's more tension associated with this, he enjoys the global focus. And attention is attention as far as he's concerned. It doesn't matter if there's vitriol, and I think there's tremendous vitriol directed at him right now. You look at a lot of the informal polls that are done on the internet, the vast majority of people who are voting blame him for the stall in this fight. Yet at the same time, when HBO has raised concerns about not wanting to co-promote a fight like this and instead wait for Mayweather's last 2 fights on his contract to expire and then exclusively promote the fight with Mayweather, pick him up as a free agent, have him fight Pacquiao in 2016, that caused such attention that HBO and their executives might be delaying the fight, that they actually released a press release to say, no, it's a lie. We would never do that. We want this to happen as much as anybody. So I think everybody is beginning to understand if this doesn't happen, we could finally see some consequence for these guys, that people won't pay to see Pacquiao fight anybody, and they certainly won't pay to see Mayweather fight Cotto a second time. Nobody is calling for that fight. I do think if either of them fight Amir Khan, you're going to get a good audience, because I frankly think Khan could win both of those fights and really, go somewhere new with this whole ordeal than anybody's really anticipating. So it's a very strange dynamic.
Again, Israel National Radio, we're listening to Ari Lewis, and we're talking about the big Mayweather-Pacquiao fight, if it's going to happen or if it's not. I want to go to what you mentioned, Mayweather currently a 3-1 favorite. You, however, said previously in my program you're not so sure if he can pull it out. Older than Pacquiao, he may have lost a step. Does Mayweather himself think or have doubts about being Pacquiao? We know Mayweather's father says that Floyd Jr. would pick apart Manny. Other people said that. But does Mayweather think that himself?
It's a good question. I mean, there are some interesting variables to look at in terms of their previous opponents, because the idea that somebody like Cotto could really get to him and rough him up, or Maidana, who's a fairly one-dimensional, I wouldn't call him a journeyman, but a rugged contender at best, bloodying his nose, striking him, dazing him on a couple of occasions. I don't think anybody would give you an argument in terms of asserting that Pacquiao is much faster, much more dangerous, much more fleet-footed, and also the added thing of he's a southpaw. Mayweather definitely, his entire stance and defensive genius is based on fighting against an orthodox stance. So there are some interesting variables there that Pacquiao presents. On the other hand, if you see somebody like Marquez as a counterpuncher being able to give Pacquiao enormous trouble over 4 fights, Mayweather demonstrated against Marquez just total dominance. And one would assume he could do the same thing against Pacquiao, win an incredibly boring decision against him. Really depends on how he wants to fight. And then it depends just how much toll his age has taken on his ability. First thing you're going to lose is your foot speed. And, maybe Pacquiao can take advantage of that. Maybe Mayweather's style can mitigate the wear and tear of he'll be 38 at the end of February. That's really getting up there. So those are some interesting things. At that age, tear an elbow, to tear a tendon, many, many things can happen in the course of a fight, that can stop it. So I think it's why people are so interested to see it happen, despite them being, it's nowhere near what it would have been 5-6 years ago.
Now, I want to go back to an aspect of people being fed up. They might boycott fights. Now, that is very unique, as you talked about. It's really never happened. If you go all the way back, Lennox Lewis Holyfield won. That was clearly a Don King fix. And people were outraged, but then they bought the fight, the rematch. They didn't have a public boycott, so we're not going to buy a Don King fight. I want to know, outside of the Amir Khan thing, if Floyd is blamed, and you said the polls indicate about 80%, would you see a boycott as actually people staying outside, don't buy this fight, ignore him, he didn't give us Pacquiao, we're not going to pay attention to him? Can you see that happening?
I think it could happen. I think the other issue is that on Mayweather's contract, given that he's guaranteed, $32.5 million for each fight, that one can assume that he's not releasing the financial numbers on his fights other than the Canelo fight, which obviously broke every record. It is the existing record breaker for pay-per-view and live gate, et cetera. That maybe they've lost money on most of the fights that they've had with Mayweather and are really pressuring him to take a fight like this where they can, like with Canelo, make some of their money back, leave the door open, win, lose, or draw for Mayweather to have a rematch against Pacquiao, which conceivably could be an even bigger fight as far as drawing more and more fans in, more and more general fans in. I think that's the big issue is the boxing fans put up with anything. I mean, the sport's been completely marginalized since it left major networks on TV. So you've got the diehard fans who will put up with anything. They'll pay more and more money to watch more and more mediocre fights and undercards. So it's the general fan that I think can come in and buy those pay-per-views and take it up to that 3 million number or push it closer to 4 potentially and with $100 a pop to buy pay-per-view. I mean, it's incredible revenue. I mean, just totally unprecedented. So the question is whether they want to sort of invite those general fans in or really alienate them and put them off boxing.
Now, we know that Floyd's financial situation is pretty well established. Again, as far as we know about his gambling, but we're told he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We know Manny Pacquiao apparently has had severe financial problems. We know that there's some sources that he's gambled away all his money. He's had women outside of his wife. What's his financial standing? And it seems like the fight would be more important to him financially, maybe for Floyd, career legacy-wise. But financially, talk about where Manny Pacquiao is at.
Well, I think Pacquiao, there's just so many people who have their hand out, and last I heard, he was still borrowing money from Bob Arum. And you just think that after somebody's earned over $200 million, where conceivably, unless some impropriety is involved, he's retaining 66% of it before taxes, why is he needing to borrow money? So with the political run for himself as a congressman, his wife, the homes he has, he's chartering planes with 200 Filipinos for every fight that he has, putting them up in hotels, paying for their gambling, paying for their food. I think that's what people don't really understand with historically all these great champions making this incredible money, just how fast it can go, where everywhere you go, people are demanding money. And Pacquiao has employed not just one or two people, but a whole team of people just to say no to all the offers of people saying, please devote money to this or that cause or this business venture that I'm doing. I don't think much has changed in the dynamic that he has right now. And keep in mind, he's added the church to the mix now to cleanse him of his former life of sin, which I'm sure, amazingly, might cost him even more money to buy his way out of all of that and all the guilt. So I think he will always desperately need money. And everybody I've ever spoken to who was close to him, as far as Leon Gass filming the recently released documentary on Pacquiao, said he will never be able to stop fighting.
Wow.
Which is a sad thing.
Very sad indeed. Again, this is Israel National Radio. You're listening to Ari Lewis. Again, we're speaking with Brin-Jonathan Butler about the potential mega fight. Manny Pacquiao versus Floyd Mayweather would be the biggest fight financially in history. Now, Brin, tell us in regards to Manny Pacquiao of the split, because we were told originally he wanted 50-50, then he was going to accept getting 40% of it. What were the terms potentially discussed or they've agreed on as far as the money split between Floyd and Manny Pacquiao?
Well, prior to these negotiations, Mayweather put out an offer, at least with social media, so take it with a grain of salt, to offer Pacquiao straight up a guaranteed $40 million to face him. And what we've heard throughout, so presumably it's accurate, is that the split that Mayweather's offering is a 60-40 in his favor. And I haven't heard that there's been any restrictions as far as if it, does tremendous pay-per-view numbers, that Pacquiao wouldn't gain extra revenue from that 60-40 split, which would be based on a $200 million pot between the two of them. So, $80 million for Pacquiao guaranteed. So it's, wildly unprecedented. There's never been anything like this.
So basically, if that were to happen and the agreement would go that way, Pacquiao would make the second biggest purse in boxing history next to Floyd, who's fighting him in that fight. That's how big. No one's ever made $80 million. The record is currently Floyd with the Canelo fight. He made 42. That's the record, right?
Yeah, it depends what the ancillary money that's tied into it. So I don't know exactly with all that extra little money that's tapped in, but yeah, that 42.5 I believe is the current record.
Now, let's talk about Floyd's relationship with Bob Arum. Bob Arum, for those who don't know, used to promote Floyd. They had a very bad falling out, partly, as you mentioned, that Floyd, this new evil character, whatever you want to call playing heel, made him all this money and felt like he could have done it earlier with Bob Arum, but Bob didn't go with it, whatever it was. How much of this is playing a role? What exactly would Floyd be blaming Bob Arum for? Bob Arum is Manny's promoter. He's going to get a cut. He's not going to walk away from this fight. So what exactly is Floyd's complaints against Bob Arum?
I think with boxing, there was tremendous acrimony between Oscar De La Hoya and Arum. And right. So it's an interesting example of kind of the opposite of Floyd, where from the beginning, There was unprecedented success for a non-heavyweight with Oscar De La Hoya. 70% of his audience who was buying pay-per-view were females. There's never been anything close to that in the sport. And still, there was bitterness and tremendous vitriol between the two of them. Pacquiao has had a very friendly relationship with Arum, but yeah, indeed, Mayweather was affiliated with Arum for a long time, really had no popularity as a fighter. He's not a knockout spectacle fighter. Safety first, defensive genius, but not really inclined to put on thrilling fights. I've never seen a great fighter more willing to stink out a fight than Floyd. If you go back and watch his fights, the vast majority of them are booed that are high-profile fights. So I think that all played a part in him not being as marketable as he thought his skills deserved. And he and Al Heyman bought out his contract with Arum and had some huge fights with Arturo Gatti, Marquez, and a couple of others leading up to Oscar De La Hoya, which is where he became this transcendent star that he is today, where that was the biggest record prior to the Canelo fight versus Mayweather. And this character of Money Mayweather, I think it was a shrewd, brilliant turn as a heel, where people were willing to dish out more money than they ever have to watch him lose. I don't think very many people, if the crowds are any indication, are cheering for him to win or are really blown away by the performances. But he has become the most marketable athlete on the planet. And that's him and Al Heyman's initiative. So they certainly deserve all the credit for that. And apparently hold a enormous grudge with Bob Arum, thinking that they could have been doing this for a long time.
You think, though, they would think, I made $300 or $400 million, I made it, so if I didn't make more of it, who cares? But I guess they don't think of it that way. Anyway, now, Brin, something I want to throw out a little bit of a curveball here, since we're a broadcaster from Israel. I know when Oscar had the breakup with Bob Arum, he said some anti-Semitic things. He said, I took on one of the biggest Jews from Harvard, and that was brought to attention. He said something anti-Semitic. Out of curiosity, have you ever heard, you're on the inside of a scoop of boxing, have you ever heard Floyd say anything anti-Semitic, especially in regards to Bob Arum?
No, I don't recall anything anti-Semitic. I mean, certainly I have seen video of him being vehemently racist against Pacquiao,
right.
And interestingly racist in remarks that were against the wrong kind of Asian, in terms of mocking him for eating sushi when obviously he's a Filipino and not Japanese.
Right.
But I mean, I think it's unavoidable in boxing. I think race is a very, very big deal and a very major marketing angle with all the fights. I think the fact that Floyd has usurped Mexican holidays for the only 2 days that he fights and likes to come out in a sombrero and, face Mexican opponents who he regularly trumpets as having an entire country behind them. I think he is trying to bait them. And yeah, I mean, it's just, I just think the racism, it transcends anti-Semitism. It's all the way around. There's some real ugliness. Arum himself has trashed the UFC on completely homophobic basis, that only homosexuals would roll around on the ground and that kind of thing. So
right.
Just ignorant prejudice seems to be omnipresent.
Yeah, that famous interview Bob Arum did with Ariel Helwani, who's been on my program, is a very strange interview. Talk about calling UFC people skinheads. As you mentioned, they roll around like homosexuals. It was a very strange interview. I almost think he did that just for the attention, but it was pretty weird. Again, this is Israel National Radio. We're talking about the big fight, which may or may not happen, Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao. Now let's talk about logistics. If the fight were to take place, originally the potential date was May 2nd. So if they're going to do this, when does the fight need to be signed so both fighters can have a proper training camp?
I mean, as soon as possible. We're already inside of 90 days. We're approaching 80 days. February the 12th will be, February is a shorter month. So we're at about 80 days right now. I don't think the fight needs any kind of promotion, given, that it already has it, without anybody trying to advertise it. So that is singular. As far as boxing matches go, it really doesn't require any kind of lead up to get people anxious and excited to be part of it. But yeah, as far as training camp, both Pacquiao and Mayweather have never had any issues related to weight ever in their career. So they are always staying in shape. But ideally, you'd want a couple of months. So I think by the end of February, really in the next week or so, I think you're going to see resolution to this, because both guys, Mayweather's under contract. He has to fight somebody May 2nd. So if it's not Pacquiao, he's going to move on to likely Cotto, but possibly Amir Khan. Pacquiao himself may fight Amir Khan or some far less desirable opponent. So this thing is going to have to happen soon for both of them. They're not getting any younger, and this is their maximum earning time. And yet, if one of them loses, if they don't fight each other, I think that's the end of this one. I think people are really fed up.
Now, I saw in a report Bob Arum said something they could extend it to May 30th. How would that work if Floyd is under contract to fight May 2nd? Would Showtime then give him a break and extend that deadline, if you will, whatever you want to call it, to fight later in May, because it would be such a big fight? Is that at all a possibility?
Not according to Floyd. Floyd has been adamant that May 2nd is his date. Arum has been trying to move that date so that he could have Canelo fight on it. Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because Arum quite disingenuously is saying that it's cultural appropriation to have a non-Mexican assume that date, but he himself has promoted a number of fights on May 2nd with non-Mexican participants. So when it suits him and when it doesn't, he raises a fuss. So I think Mayweather definitely, that's his date. So May 2nd and then the holiday in September. And he's just got 2 fights left, and I think he is probably having the Showtime network executives breathing down his neck. I mean, as much as he likes to say that Pacquiao, has a boss, and he doesn't have a boss, he does have a boss. He's employed right now by Showtime, which is employed by CBS, and they want the ratings on this. They need that revenue. So there's some pressure there.
All right. Now, the final things, again, we started this interview saying Arum said 2 of the things were done, 2 of the things were not done. So what are the 2 things that are not done that is potentially up in the air?
As I mentioned, I think the most likely scenario is that it is the rebroadcast rights.
Right.
That's got to be the number one. And then sounds like all the particulars as far as, the weight class that they'll fight, could be an issue there. Obviously Mayweather took huge advantage of coming in heavier. We don't know how much heavier, because in an unprecedented move, he didn't allow the network to show how much weight he had gained after the weigh-in because he was already over when he fought Marquez, and then presumably he gained another 10 pounds. I mean, he looked enormous by way of comparison. So he'll take every advantage that he can against Pacquiao, and certainly in his fight against Oscar De La Hoya. De La Hoya made a comment recently, I think over the last couple of days, to say that when De La Hoya fought Mayweather, he took 80% of that purse because he was such a draw and because Mayweather had never established himself as a pay-per-view star. But there were many other considerations with that fight where Floyd was forced to acquiesce to De La Hoya's demands in order to get that fight and get the opportunity to be in the position that he is now. So what you're seeing is Mayweather is certainly enjoying the fruits of being undefeated and having a couple of these massive pay-per-view fights under his belt so he can dictate all the terms and use them to every possible advantage against Pacquiao. So, I mean, I wonder how nitpicky it could be, if it could be weight, if it could be, is it monetary, revenue as far as if it exceeds a certain pay-per-view total, how much of that does Floyd keep versus Pacquiao? It's hard to say because they're just not releasing the information, and everything that Mayweather releases even his own side of HBO network executives are talking against it. So it's really unclear why Arum would be voicing some of these concerns or updates in social media, because it doesn't seem to be helping anything. It seems to be sabotaging. I don't really understand the method of it, unless he doesn't want the fight to happen, and I'm not sure why he would want, that reputation with taking responsibility for that. So it's puzzling.
Now, in regards to the weight, Floyd is a naturally bigger person, and I'm curious if you could tell us what weight is good for who. Now, we know when Manny beat Oscar De La Hoya was at the end of his career, but that was at 147, and when Floyd fought Oscar, the weight class was 154. So I wonder if you could tell us, if you're in Manny's camp, what fight would you want the weight to be at?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that Pacquiao, when Pacquiao fought Margarito, I think he was 2 or 3 pounds under the limit. He just has no business being way up there in really the 140s. So the lighter it could go would go to his advantage, and obviously Floyd, the bigger it can be. So it's just going to depend on just really how willing Mayweather is to bend to, obviously he knows what we do, which is that Pacquiao is a very little guy, 5'5", probably half his body weight in those calves of his. They're just enormous. So I guess low 140s is probably what we'll see. But again, both these guys are in pristine condition. Never had any issues with weight in the past. It's just that getting up there, certainly Mayweather's a lot more comfortable being the much bigger man. He's got really abnormally long arms for his height. So Pacquiao has quite a short reach, but much sturdier legs. So yeah, that'll be a very interesting feature, because when Pacquiao fought De La Hoya, one of the major issues there was just how dehydrated De La Hoya looked and moved around as a result of how low the weight was for him, who's a much bigger guy naturally at 5'10".
Yeah, Freddie Roach said that was one of the main reasons he knew De La Hoya was going to lose to Manny Pacquiao. Again, this is Israel National Radio. You're listening to Ari Lewis. We're speaking to Brin-Jonathan Butler about the mega fight. Brin, all this time, this interview, we discussed money, we discussed potential if the fight will happen and obstacles. We haven't really talked about the fight itself, so let's take a few minutes on it. As you mentioned, Floyd, a 3-1 favorite. You mentioned Floyd, the older fighter, if he's lost a step. How would you break down the fight if it actually does happen?
I think 3-1 is very warranted in favor of Mayweather, simply because I don't know how you would really bait him in to a really thrilling, exciting fight that would cater to all of the advantages of Pacquiao. But then again, what's interesting is he's had some pretty rough fights against Cotto and Maidana, a lot rougher than anybody anticipated. So, the argument would be, Pacquiao obliterated Cotto. So if Mayweather's having that much trouble with a Cotto, what would Pacquiao do? And then you go the other way and you say, well, we've just seen Marquez almost murder Pacquiao in their 4th fight. The ease with which Mayweather handled Marquez, what would he do to Pacquiao? So those variables are always intriguing. Like we saw in the 1970s with the heavyweights. How big a favorite was Foreman versus Ali on the basis of what he did to Norton and Frazier? But styles make fights, and 10 times out of 10, probably Ali's going to beat Foreman, and who knows how he'll do against Frazier. He's almost dying, and a couple of those fights were just so brutal. And then, against Norton, Ali, broke a jaw in the first round and really struggled, and those were highly contested decisions that he won. So where do the styles match up with Pacquiao and Mayweather? I think the big question mark is how Mayweather would be able to handle a southpaw stance, the aggression of Pacquiao. If we see Pacquiao like he fought Algieri, who granted it had absolutely no business being in the ring with a Hall of Fame fighter, despite that he wasn't let out of the cage by his trainer, unfortunately. But yeah, I think this is why it's such compelling fare is these variables and hypothetical matches, not hypothetical, but the matches we've seen and trying to come up with a hypothetical version to sort of decode what would unfold. I personally, would expect Mayweather to be able to comfortably outbox Pacquiao, but then again, we've seen Mayweather slow down. We've seen him lose a step. We've seen him get hit. We've seen him get hurt with Shane Mosley, with Maidana. We've seen him be willing to go toe-to-toe with Cotto. If any of those scenarios happen with Pacquiao, he is fully capable of winning that fight, and he is a tenacious finisher still. Not what he was, but it's still an absolutely enthralling fight to consider just how exciting it could be. And again, it could be a pretty pedestrian affair. I don't know that Mayweather De La Hoya was an epic fight. It certainly was epic in the anticipation of it. How it unfolded, not so much. But Mayweather's had some very exciting fights. Certainly some of the most exciting fights of the last several years. In his last three with Maidana, the rematch and the original, and versus Cotto. So I'm optimistic about it, but then again, I wouldn't be shocked if there was something about it that disappointed everybody. We have to remember that even Tyson Spinks was very disappointing for a lot of people, given how fast it ended. We look back at it, and it's part of the Tyson legend, but at the time, people were like, I paid $1,000 for a ringside seat for 91 seconds? Like, what?
Right, and they built it up as Michael Spinks was the one guy who could stand up to Tyson. He had an awkward stance. He'd never been knocked down. He was taller than him, and it was 91 seconds. Brin, last question we have for you. I want to know about legacies. Talk about each boxer, their legacy if they win, their legacy if they lose. My opinion, you look at Pacquiao, kind of has a bit of a Rocky flair to him, meaning he can lose, people will still like him. I feel like if Floyd loses, it completely will change around his legacy. People will say, oh, you put him with a real boxer, and, they'll have a revisionist history about it. I want to know what you think. Talk about legacy for each man if they win or if they lose.
Well, I think you nailed the absolute most fascinating element of this fight, and that is if Pacquiao loses, it does absolutely nothing to his legacy. It in no way negatively impacts all of the tremendous fight. I mean, he has 4 Hall of Fame careers built into his existing career, given he's fought everybody. He has annihilated stellar competition that nobody expected him to be able to dominate in many scenarios. I mean, 8 divisions as world champion. It's unprecedented. If Mayweather loses this, I think you are going to see a career evaluation that is even more thankless than what Tyson endured against Buster Douglas, because I think people will look back and say he was incredibly selective in who he fought. Were the fights themselves very compelling? I still think personally he lost to Castillo in the first fight. It was close, but I think he lost that fight. I think that could have been why he was avoiding Pacquiao early on when this first fight was really building up intensity to happen. He didn't want another guy who could go 12 rounds just tearing into him the entire time, because it gave him problems. So I think Mayweather has not garnered very much goodwill from fight fans. I think he has very cynically exploited them and really done massive damage to the sport. And so I think people would love to see him lose, and I think people are anticipating that outside the ring, obviously with his almost obligation to beating women with, I think, 7 arrests that he's had for battering women, that he is a ticking time bomb, and he comes from a family of not just misogynists, but batterers against women. So all that negativity is what he's used to promote his brand with this, cynical exploitation of, like the movies from the mid-'90s. An actor makes $20 million and they try to sneak it through to get you to go in to see it, and you see it and you think it's terrible, and then they're laughing their way to the bank saying they had some tremendous box office over the weekend. I don't think that's the measure of quality, is just how much money it makes, and that's the only metric that Mayweather really has to show that he's the best ever, is he's made more money than anybody else. But I don't think that Mike Tyson's career after prison, despite the fact that he made more money than anybody in history, was a really stellar achievement as he regained the heavyweight championship. It was incredibly cynical and mean-spirited and ugly and damaged the sport badly. I think Mayweather's legacy will be the same whether he wins or loses this fight. I think time will not be kind to the kind of person he was in and out of the ring, but he's undefeated, and he's always tried to use that as the only metric to sort of get at his worth. And I think if he lost, people would reevaluate that record and say, well, yeah, he's perfect because he avoided a lot of the major fights. He didn't do it in the first half of his career. He didn't really have the ability to. But in the second half of the career, when he had real options to fight some of the top guys out there, he ducked them, and he was very careful about who he fought. Now, given where most of the fighters go in terms of becoming destitute or damaged or worse, can you blame him? No, but then I don't think you can tell me that you're the best ever, because I don't think you really ever took the chances that the greats did. So I don't like the idea of him conflating himself with the greats and just saying I'm even better because I have a better record. He does have a better record, but it's only because of what I think has been some cowardice and cynicism.
Yeah, and you know what? That's the whole thing, how things can turn around quickly with one fight. People right now saying he's the greatest ever. If he loses, I think they'll drop that right away. Brin, this has been a pleasure. We certainly appreciate it. Tell everyone out there, excuse me, where they can read more of your material and find out more about your work.
Well, if you go on to Amazon.com, you've got my ebook, A Cuban Boxer's Journey. You have the Kindle Singles interview I did for Amazon with Mike Tyson. That's an interesting read with some really pretty out there revelations that he makes in that interview that he hadn't made prior. I have an interview coming out with Errol Morris with the Kindle Singles series, and a memoir coming out in June called The Domino Diaries, all of which can be ordered or pre-ordered right now. So, yeah.
All right, everyone go out there and do that. It's a great article. Brin, we really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll find out in a day or so that this fight will happen, and then we can actually talk about the fight the next time you come on. So, again, thank you so much for being on my show today. Great job as always. We really appreciate it, and we'll speak soon.
My pleasure. That was fun.
All right, thanks so much. Be well.
Take care, man.